All right, so I am going to have Wendy and Diane introduce yourselves to the group, and we'll get started.
Great, thank you, Karen. This is Wendy Freischlag, and I'm an assessments consultant with Riverside Assessments. I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining the call today.
CogAT, yeah, it's called CogAT.
Taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this presentation on getting more out of your CogAT scores for all of your students. Today I'm joined by my colleague Denise Pyatt, who's also an assessments consultant with Riverside. And together we support Colorado educators, schools, and districts on testing products like the Cognitive Abilities Test and the Iowa assessments. I think there's someone in the background that might not have their microphone muted. If you could just check real quick and mute your microphone, that would be great. Thank you.
Usually when this is plugged in, I have sound on the computer. I unplug it.
I'm trying to find out.
Should I turn on my briefing board maybe? I'm just trying to.
But you're right, if the headphones are unplugged.
We're going to wait just a minute. I think it's Anne.
I muted her.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So today we're going to spend about 50 minutes discussing how you can use the CogAT test information to differentiate instruction for all students. And during the session, as Karen explained, you're going to be in a listen-only mode. But if you have a question, please do submit it to the chat box, and Denise will be monitoring that as the session goes on. And we'll have a Q&A at the end, provided there's time. And you'll have time to submit questions then too as well. So we'll make sure all your questions get answered. I want to start off by acknowledging a myth that is out there about the CogAT test. There's a myth that it's just a test for identifying gifted students. But in reality, the CogAT can be used as a differentiation tool for all students. And today, what we want to do is take a detailed look at the CogAT Ability Profile Score and break it down into its three main components to help you better understand how it's derived and what it means. And then we're going to take some time to allow you to analyze a few sample students and to look at the different resources you have available to you to help make sure you can ensure that all students succeed in school. The CogAT is an assessment that measures students' general and abstract inductive and deductive reasoning abilities. And we do that across three batteries: the verbal, quantitative, and the nonverbal. Each of the batteries has three different subtests. So there's 9 different item types in the full CogAT. And this helps educators, it provides them with a comprehensive perspective of a student's cognitive reasoning abilities. We know that the skills and abilities measured by the CogAT reflect the cognitive processes and the strategies that help individuals learn new tasks and solve problems. And because these are the types of abilities that are closely related to an individual's success in school in virtually all subjects, your CogAT results are going to be very helpful in planning effective instructional programs and adapting instruction to enhance all students' chance of success in learning. A student's ability test scores can help provide information about the pace of instruction, complexity, and the degree and structure that will be most effective for the student. Here's a look at the types of items for those of you, if you're not familiar with them, if you use CogAT scores but you've never seen the assessment. These are the items that appear on the verbal subtests. So on the left-hand side are the item formats for our youngest students, students in kindergarten through 2nd grade. And the words you see on the screen here are only for illustration purposes. For students in these younger grades, all of the item formats are picture-based. There is one subtest in the entire assessment for our youngest students that requires language reception, and that's the sentence completion section here. And the proctor reads, or the audio tracker reads, a question to the students, and they pick the answer that best answers that question. Otherwise, the entire assessment for K through 2 students is nonverbal. Now, on the right-hand side, you see what the items formats look like for verbal battery for our older students, grades 3 on up. And you can see there is an English language load here. They have to be able to read words and short sentences. So the verbal reasonabilities that the CogAT measures are obviously important to education because a lot of the curriculum that we teach our students is taught using language, like reading, listening, and writing. So verbal reasoning can be measured irrespective of native language, and it includes the ability to infer meaning of new words, to make sense out of verbal information, to recognize patterns in concepts, and to express complex ideas verbally and in writing. For the quantitative subtest, it is also a nonverbal format for all students. Again, on the left-hand side are the item formats for the students in the youngest grades, kindergarten through second, and they're presented with picture-based items in all 3 subtests. And then our older students are presented with numbers and common mathematical notations, but it's still in an all nonverbal format. And for the CogAT, the assessment is available with directions for administration in both English and Spanish at all levels of the test. So quantitative reasoning is not quite as broadly important as the verbal reasoning is in education, but it's still crucial for mathematics and many scientific fields. The quantitative reasoning involves the student's ability to recognize patterns in numbers and to devise strategies for solving quantitative problems. The nonverbal items are pretty much the same across all levels of the test, but as you go up in levels, they become increasingly more difficult. So the figural or abstract reasoning is the least directly tied to education, although it can be still very useful. Figural reasoning is usually measured with abstract or figural representations. For example, as you see here on the screen, shapes and visual patterns or shading. And it's going to involve the students recognizing patterns or recognizing and planning problem-solving solutions using these abstract figures. So that's a quick look at the item types. I also want to just briefly cover the primary uses of the CogAT, and there are 3. First, the CogAT is going to help, scores you receive from CogAT will help teachers adapt instructional goals, methods, and materials to meet the individual needs of students. You also can use the CogAT to capture important information that's not really shown on report cards or in grades or other measures of achievement. And so we use it for program placement, like for gifted and talented. And then finally, we use the CogAT to help identify students whose predicted levels of achievement, the scores there, are markedly different than what we'd expect them to be from their CogAT scores. And so knowing that there's a difference between these two really helps in determining the cause to help guide instructional decisions. So today we're really going to focus our efforts on the first one, to adapt instruction. And to begin with, I want to quickly cover just a few of the score types you're going to come across to make sure you understand them and that you understand how they relate to one another. So the CogAT is going to give you scores for each individual battery, for the verbal, the quantitative, and the nonverbal, as shown across the top line. And then you're also going to get a series of subcomposites and a full composite score. The subcomposite shown here, the QN, is particularly useful for math and science. And the rest of the scores here, some of the most commonly used, I'm going to cover the last 4 in a little bit more detail on the following slides. And before I do that, I want to show you this bell curve. So CogAT scores are going to form a normal distribution or a bell curve. And I'm going to continue to refer back to this illustration to show you different score types, how they lay across the bell curve and how they relate to one another. This particular diagram, we have shown here the stanines, the 9 broad stanines that go across the bell curve, and then kind of the interpretation of the different levels. And you can see that the majority of our students, or just a slight majority, 54% of our students are going to fall within the 4th, 5th, and 6th stanines right across the middle of this bell curve. The first score I'd like to discuss is the standard age score. And that's going to compare an individual's performance with that of other students who are at the same age. And when we talk in terms of age in the CogAT, we measure it by year and months of age. So the SAS is a normalized scale, and it has an average score of 100. So if you think back to that previous slide of the bell curve, right down the middle, the very middle is a 100, and that's at the 50th percentile. And this is going to be true for both forms of the CogAT and for every test level and every subtest. SAS score of 100 will always be the 50th percentile. So the SAS score is most often used for program identification because it's a little bit more discriminate. Some people confuse it with a IQ score, and it is not the same, but it does correlate with the IQ score. And you're going to have a range of SAS scores from 50 to 160. So here's an example of a student roster report. And on here in the red box, you'll see the standard age scores across for the student Drew. They're usually reported with the age percentile rank because they're closely tied together. So speaking of the percentile rank, the CogAT does report out these scores. It's a score that many people are familiar with, parents as well as educators. And it's going to provide you, it's going to indicate the relative standing of a student in comparison with other students of a particular norm group. And the CogAT is going to report out two types of percentile ranks, the age percentile rank and the grade percentile rank. So the age percentile rank is most commonly used because we have such a broad range of ages of students in a single grade. For instance, if you look at second grade, we may have students who are 7 to 9 years old in the same grade. So if we use a grade percentile rank to compare them, we're going to be comparing 7-year-olds to 9-year-olds in some instances. But if we use the age percentile rank, it's going to normalize it out and compare students to other students of the same age by year and month of age. As I mentioned before, there is a fixed relationship with the SAS. So for instance, a standard age score of 116 is always going to be in the 84th percentile, no matter what form, level, or battery of the test. So we often use percentile ranks to communicate with parents and students because they're so familiar with them. But the disadvantage, which I'm going to go into a little bit greater detail in a few slides, is that because it's distributed unequally across the bell curve, small changes can be easily misrepresented. Here's a look at one of our most popular reports, the list of student scores. And if your district uses Riverside Assessments for your scoring services to have your CogAT test results scored, you're going to receive back a printed list of student scores. And on this, you request which scores you like. Here, shown in the red boxes, are both the age percentile rank and the grade percentile rank. And you'll notice that that standard age score is listed next to the age percentile rank. Okay, let's look back at that bell curve one more time. So now I have on this illustration the percentile ranks across the bottom. And do you see how, with compared to the stanines above them, the stanines are equally distributed in equal increments, where the percentile ranks are unevenly distributed across the bell curve. And so the major disadvantage of percentile ranks is misinterpretation of differences. So let's say, for example, we have a student who is in the 50th percentile on the quantitative battery, and we're comparing them to a student who scores the 55th percentile. It's really insignificant. Those scores are both going to fall, right here in the middle of the fifth stanine. So we have 20% of our students here within this one stanine. So 50 to 55 is very tight and really the same level of ability. But if you were to talk about comparing a student who has an age percentile rank in the 90th percentile up here compared to a student in the 95th, there's quite a significant difference between those two scores. You would really see that the student with the higher percentile rank does have a higher ability in the quantitative battery. So that's what we mean by small differences can be easily misrepresented, where that would not happen with a broad grouping like a stanine. And that's the next score we're going to look at. So the stanine, as you saw in the bell curve, consists of 9 broad categories that spread across the bell curve, with 1 on the far left and 9 on the far right. And a teacher can look at those and use the following information to describe them. You'd say that a student had a stanine of 1, 2, or 3 would be low, 4, 5, or 6 medium or average, and 7, 8, or 9 high in very general terms. And so since it's hard to overinterpret differences, stanines are another good score we can use to discuss with parents and students about their results. Here's a little bit closer look at the stanines, not in the bell curve, but showing you the percentages. So you see in that middle range, stanines 4, 5, and 6, that's where 54% of our students will score. And then out on the outer edges, only 4% are going to have a stay 9 of 1, and 4% would have a stay 9 of 9. Here's an example of a report where you'll see not only the stay 9 that a student's scores fall in, but also their percentile rank. So this particular student in the verbal battery is in the 6th stay 9 or the 65th percentile, and their nonverbal score is also in the 6th stay 9 or the 69th percentile, and then their quantitative scores out here in the 8th stay 9. So that's what a stay 9 might look like on a report. All right, we're going to take one last look to overlap these scores all together. So this image is going to show you the percentile ranks, the stay 9s, and the standard age scores all laid out together, and you can see them here on the screen. And in the oval example I have here, we have a student who has a standard age score of 110. So that puts them in the 74th percentile or in the 6th stay 9. And they all mean the same thing, so you could use any of those scores to describe that student's performance. You see the dotted line right to the middle of the bell curve? That's the 100th, a 100 score of SAS of a 100, and it's always going to be there no matter the battery or no matter the test level. So you can kind of plant that image in your brain. And in Colorado, when we identify, we're looking for students to have a score of the 95th percentile. And that's going to be equivalent of a SAS score of 126 or 127. I put this chart in here. I pulled it out of the Norms and Score Conversion Guide from the CogAT because I wanted it to be here for you to refer to later. And I think it's really handy because you have shown here the standard age scores and their corresponding percentile ranks and stay 9s, as well as the normal curve equivalent, all in one chart. Makes it for an easy reference if you're ever curious to look that up. It's also found in the Norms and Score Conversion Guide. So here's that. I almost hit the wrong button here. I apologize. That 100, SAS 100 with the 50th percentile rank.
Wendy?
Yes.
I would just like to let everybody know that they're getting the PowerPoint and the documents later. They'll be sent to them. So I want them to know that they'll get all this information.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because I meant to mention it at the first slide. I got a little distracted. So thank you. Yes, I've already sent it to Karen, so she has it to send out to you with the evaluation. So now I want to spend a little time, now that we understand a little bit about the scores, we're going to look a little closer at them and at a particular score called the Ability Profile Score and better understand that. And so before we start, I want to zoom in on a section of a list of student scores report and look at these different confidence bands shown here. So what you see on this screen are like a subsection for 3 different students and their scores. So the rectangular boxes are what we call the confidence bands, and the students' actual data points are the diamonds. So that's their actual score. And the band you see surrounding that score is where we are confident that student's true score lies. So the first thing I want to point out here is that you'll notice some of these bands are very narrow and others are wider. So what does that mean? So the very bottom bar, is the dark black one, is very narrow. We have great confidence that this student's score lies within that range. And then up here we have a much wider confidence band. So why would that be? We have less confidence around what that student's actual score, where it may lie. Well, maybe this student's scores were inconsistent. Maybe they answered all the most difficult questions correctly and then missed some of the easiest ones. That's going to cause us to have less confidence of where their true score lies. And I'm showing you this image now because we're going to talk a lot about the patterns of student scores. And you can see how each student's score here forms kind of a different pattern with those confidence bands. So kind of keep that image in your mind as we move forward. And we'll come back and look at more confidence bands in a little while. So the majority of our time today is going to be spent dissecting and understanding the ability profile score. So shown in the middle of the screen here in blue is what we'd call an ability profile score. And it's made up of 3 parts: the stay 9, which is a leading number, the profile, which is going to be an alpha character, and then there may be relative strengths or weaknesses following that in parentheses. So the stay 9 is the median level of performance that the student had across the 3 batteries. The profile is going to be the pattern or what those confidence bands look like. Do they overlap one another? Are they spread out? Are they kind of tight? Do they cluster a couple of them and other ones outline? How does that pattern look like? So we're going to call that the spread or pattern of scores. And then more than half of our students are going to have at least one relative strength or one relative weakness. And we can use these different elements of the ability profile score to differentiate instruction. So let's break it down one element at a time. We're going to mainly look at the level and the pattern of a student's score. So the typical magnitude of their scores would be the level, and then the pattern of those scores, whether they cluster together, have strengths or weaknesses, is going to be the pattern of their scores. So if we look at that median stay-9, so what's the median? The median is simply the middle score, okay? And it's going to express what we feel is the average, the median of that student's profile level. So if you look in the yellow box on the slide here, here's the student's scores. They scored in the 8th stay-9. Remember, that's above average here. I have a bell curve here for you to see. In verbal, a 6 on the quantitative, and then they're in the 5th stay-9 on nonverbal. So those following two scores are firmly in that average zone. So to assign stay-9, the student has a 6, and it's simply the middle score. It's not an average of those 3 scores, it's the middle score. Okay, so it's pretty easy to come up with. So if I go and give you an example in this green box, take a look at this student's scores and determine to yourself what you think their median stay-9 would be. If you're looking for the middle score, the student has a 4, a 6, and a 7, it's going to be the 6. So both of these students' profile level that we could differentiate from would be a 6. But if just at a glance, these two students are really very different, even though they have the same profile level. The top student has above average abilities in the verbal battery, and the bottom student is really at the bottom level of average. So even though they both have a 6 for their profile level, they really are quite different students. So now let's look at the pattern of a student's scores. And there are 4 different types of patterns or profiles that a student could have: A, B, C, or E. So an A profile means that those confidence bands that we looked at earlier all overlap one another. They're kind of all about the same level for an A profile. In fact, their highest SAS score on their battery and their lowest SAS score are going to have no more than 10 points of difference between them. So that student's going to have very balanced level. All they're going to have is their median stay-9 and an A profile. So they do not have a relative weakness or strength. So all of their scores are all about the same. For a B profile, you're going to have 2 scores that kind of hang together, and then one that's either above or below the other 2 scores. And then the difference between their highest and lowest SAS is going to be between 11 and 23 points. Then for the C profile, these profile scores are in contrast with one another. So you're going to see them spread out. They're not going to have much overlap at all between those confidence bands. And the difference between the highest and lowest is still going to be between 11 and 23 points. And then the final profile or pattern type that a student could have would be an E profile, and that's for extreme. And what that is really is that there's just a greater gap between the highest and lowest SAS scores for that student across the 3 batteries. It's going to be more than 24 points. And you could still have an extreme B type profile where 2 scores hang together, or an extreme C where the scores are all spread apart from each other. So let's look at each one of those in just a little bit more depth. So this slide shows an example of a student with an A profile. They have an 8A profile. And if we look at those confidence bands, you see how they all overlap one another. That's your first hint that it's going to be an A profile. And if you look to the left, we have the student's standard age scores. So the student's highest score is 125. Their lowest is 116. So we have 9 points of difference between the highest and lowest. It's going to be an A profile. So this student's scores are all about the same, and you're going to find that 44% of your students have this type of profile, an A profile. For B profiles, I have two examples here. B profiles, remember, are one score is above or below the other two scores. So in both of these examples, you can see how two scores kind of hang together and one is either above or below those two. So in the top example, that student has a score that hangs below, so they're going to have a relative weakness. This particular student is a 7B nonverbal relative weakness. And if we look at the difference in their SAS scores, their lowest is the 100 and their highest is 120. So we have 20 points difference. That would make this a B profile with a relative weakness in nonverbal. Now this bottom example, the student's score span goes from 92 to 110, so 18 points difference. But they have a relative strength because that nonverbal score is hanging out to the right. So it's a relative weakness for this student compared to the other one. So that's an example of what two different B profiles might look like. 33% of our students will have a B profile, so they're going to have either a strength or a weakness. So if you just look at A and B profiles together, 77% of our students are going to have either an A or a B profile. The C profile shown here, the student's score is a 6C, and they have both a relative strength and a relative weakness. So every C profile is going to have both. A C profile, you can see how the confidence bands look like they overlap a little bit, but there's more than 10 points apart here. They go from 100 to 120. There's 20 points difference between their highest and lowest SAS score across the batteries. So it's going to be a C profile. So they're going to have, this student has a relative strength in verbal and a relative weakness in the nonverbal battery. And this is where you'll find about 12% of our students have a C profile. When you look at this leading staining for a C profile student, this 6, it becomes less meaningful on a C profile because the student has stanines in multiple areas, where an A profile student would have the stanine in all 3 batteries would be the same. So it's very meaningful for an A profile student, and for a B profile student, it's pretty meaningful as well because it's in 2 of their batteries. And then our final profile type is an E profile, and this is just an extreme of a C or of a B. This example here is an extreme C. The difference between the highest and lowest SAS is 28 points. The student also has a relative strength and a relative weakness. Now, some E profile students will only have one or the other because they could have an extreme B profile where 2 of their scores hang together and then they have one that's significantly higher or significantly lower than the other 2. So this is a little bit rarer type of score. 10% of our students have an E profile. And then in general, in our gifted population, we see about 12% of our students have an E profile. So that's kind of an interesting fact. All right. So here's a look at several different profiles put together here in a description, a general description or interpretation of each one. And what I think the most important point here is that I want to re-emphasize is that for students with an A profile or a B profile, that leading median stanine is pretty meaningful, and we can use it to adapt instruction from. And in fact, for students who have an A profile, that's really all we have. Since they're balanced, they don't have any relative strengths or weaknesses. And students who have a C or an E profile, their leading stanine or their median stanine isn't as important, but it still can be used to differentiate for that student. All right, so I'm going to show you a CogAT score sheet on in a couple slides here, and I want you to think about a few things about what you know about these students and see if what we've discussed through these last different slides is sunk in. But first, I want to go ahead and bring back up that bell curve because I think it does such a nice illustration. And if you can get this in your head, I think it really helps, or have it referenced later on to really see how the different scores relate to one another. All right. So here's an example of 3 different students, and we have some scores on the left and then their confidence bands over on the right. So let's focus first on the confidence bands. And if you look at these 3 students, who do you think has the highest overall ability? what's shown on that graph is the age percentile rank. So percentile rank of 1 would be at the left, and the percentile rank of 99 would be over at the right. So in looking at this, we see our middle student, Kai, his scores are all, or her scores are all at the higher, at the right-hand edge. Overall has the greatest, highest ability levels of these 3 students. Now, if we look at the confidence bands again, which of these students, if any, have any relative strengths or weaknesses? Just looking at those confidence bands. You can begin to see how it makes it a little bit easier to see. It's true that all 3 of these students have at least a strength or a weakness. Okay, so now let's look a little deeper, and let's take our first student, Katrina. Right here are the standard age scores for Katrina for the 3 batteries, and this is her composite score. So we're going to focus on the 3 battery age scores. And then we have her percentile rank, and then next to that are the Stanines. So if we look at the student's confidence bands, do you see how they're spread apart? What kind of profile do you think Katrina would have? An A would be all about the same. B would have 2 hanging together, one above or below. A C, they would be in contrast, or E, extreme. So it looks like she probably has a C profile. And if we look over to figure out that leading Stanine over here, she has a 7, an 8, and a 5. So her median Stanine, you can figure out what that would be. It's going to be the one in the middle. So it's going to be a 7. So Katrina's going to have a 7C profile. And now all we have to do is identify her relative strengths or weaknesses. And she has one of each because she's got a C profile. So she's got a relative weakness in nonverbal and a relative strength in the quantitative, excuse me. So let's bring that up here. So she's got a 7C, Q plus, and minus. All right, let's take a look at Kai here in the middle and look at his confidence bands and see if you can determine what kind of profile you think that Kai would have. We have 2 scores kind of hanging together, so this is going to be a B profile because one score is above the other 2 scores. So we can determine Kai's median Stanine level. Kai has got a 9, an 8, and a 9. So it's a score in the middle. So Kai would have a 9, would be Kai's median Stanine level. It's a score that's in the middle. And then we need to determine if he's got a relative strength or weakness. So you can see that Kai's got a 9B profile with a relative strength in the nonverbal battery. And I hope you're tracking along with me. Let's look at our 3rd and final student, Edgar, and look at Edgar's confidence bands. You can see there's quite a difference between these. We have 2 that hang together like a B profile, but there's quite a distance. So to determine if this is an E profile student, you really need to look at their standard age scores and the difference between the highest and lowest. So it looks like 76 to 105. There are 29 points difference in the student's score. That puts this student into an E profile. And then we need to figure out Edgar's relative strength or weakness. And the Stanine. So Edgar has Stanines of 5, 5, and 2. So he's a 5E with a relative weakness in the verbal battery. So now that you've seen a few different ability profile scores and hopefully know how to determine the median Stanine or the level of the student's score, and then the pattern A, B, C, or E, you can use those pieces of information along with the strengths and weaknesses to differentiate instruction. So let's look at how each of those pieces would work. So first we can use the level of a student's score or that leading median Stanine to differentiate from. So for students with an A profile, this is really the only piece of information we have, because they're going to have a score something like a 3A, a 5A, a 7A, a 9A, and all their scores are within the same median stay 9. And so this is going to be very meaningful for differentiating for them. For B students, the same is true. It's still very meaningful because 2 of their scores kind of hang together. So that median stay 9 is going to be true for 2 of their scores. And their third score is going to be fairly tight to the other 2, just not the same median. All of the following pages I'm going to show you were taken from the CogAT Score Interpretation Guide and also from the CogAT Short Guide for Teachers on differentiating instruction. These are 2 resources that are available to you via the Data Manager Digital Resource Library. And I'm going to show you how to access that library and where it's located in a few slides here. So based upon the recommendations that are there, this is just a very short, very small picture of the amount of information that's there for you to use. These are ones that you're going to use when you're differentiating by overall ability. And the first thing we're going to do is give you information on characteristics of a student at these different median stay 9 levels. But we're also going to provide you with information on how to build on strengths. We're going to give you strategies for working on or focusing on working memory. We're going to discuss how to scaffold. And we're also going to encourage strategic thinking and also discuss just different various grouping strategies, all based upon that median stay 9 level. So this is another example of how you might build on strengths depending on what that student's overall median stay 9 level is. This also came from the CogAT Score Interpretation Guide. And so here on this slide, for a student in stay 9s 1 through 3, interest and motivation are going to be the most important thing for these kids. They're going to take longer to solve problems. They're going to struggle more with learning. And so you're going to need to find ways to engage these students with their interests. And if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, those students in the 9th stay 9, their single greatest need is going to be for academic challenge at a level that's commensurate with their abilities and their achievements. So you're going to want to provide them with opportunities to explore their interests and skills in an independent and open-ended project. So that's an example of just a couple of areas or a couple of ways you can differentiate based upon that median stay 9 level. Okay, that's just a scratch of the surface that what can be found in those 2 resources. So those differentiating on overall ability is great for A and B profile students, and even a little bit so for C and E. But for your students that have a relative strength or weakness, you're going to use the pattern of their scores to differentiate. So this is going to be meaningful for all students except those with an A profile. Remember, 44% of our kids have an A profile. So let's take a closer look at some of the resources for building on strengths and shoring up weaknesses. So approximately half of the kids who take the CogAT are going to have either a relative strength and or weakness in one of the 3 batteries. So understanding this is going to provide you with the opportunity to adapt instruction, to help build up a student's strengths, and to use that to shore up any weaknesses. So the slide shown here was taken from the CogAT Score Interpretation Guide. And we provide just a few of the recommendations you're going to find in the CogAT Guide for Teachers and the Score Interpretation Guide that are going to help you build on a relative strength. And they're going to be organized by batteries. So whether they have a relative strength in the verbal, the quantitative, or the nonverbal, we're going to give you different suggestions for adaptations. And then we're also going to do the same to help you develop a relative weakness that a student may have. So shown here on this slide are some of those divided or separated out by battery. And we don't want to encourage students to avoid their weaknesses, but we want to leverage on their strengths and use them to shore up their weaknesses. All right, so where are all these resources found? I want to leave the slideshow for a minute here, and we're going to go out to cogat.com. So you should see that the data manager login page. This is found at the URL riversidedatamanager.com, and that's on that slide, so you'll have that reference in your slide deck. You're going to go ahead and log in, and we'll talk about if you don't have an account, what you might do about getting one. So when you first land into Data Manager, you're going to come to the overview page. And over here at the left, you'll see the digital resource library. If you click on that, it's going to open up, and it's organized by assessment and also for Data Manager. You're going to want to look in the Cognitive Abilities Test here tab. And when I click on that, what shows up in the middle, the resources available, changes. And you can see there's a number of resources here that you could access. This is complimentary for districts who use scoring services or who test online using the CogAT. And you also can, if you do hand scoring at all, which there aren't a lot of districts in the state that hand score, but if you use hand scoring, you can also buy access to the digital resource library. So the guides that we've been talking about up till now are found in the score interpretation guides. If I open up that folder, I can see the score interpretation guide as well as a web reporting supplement. So if I click on that PDF file, it's going to open up a new tab to the right, and I'm going to have my score interpretation guide. I can navigate through this. You can see here the number of pages there are for adapting instruction goes on. There's many, many pages. We don't have time to cover this all, but it's here in great detail that you can use. You're welcome to print this document or to use it online, whatever works best for you. So that's where the score interpretation guide can be found. And if I go back here to our page, right below that is the short guide for teachers. It's going to open up in a new tab. This is a resource that's about 39 pages in length, so it's a little bit more condensed. It's going to function the same way. It's a PDF file that you're welcome to print or to use on screen. And it's really put together for teachers to use for differentiating. And it's maybe organized similar to the score interpretation guide. And you see it's covered in different parts depending on the leading Stay9 level or building on strengths and weaknesses. This guide I want to mention here has been in the underway of being updated. It's going to be renamed and called the CogAT Guide for Teachers, and will come out in about the next quarter. And it's going to be a little bit more robust, probably about 30% larger. But it's a good place for classroom teachers to start because it's a little bit more condensed, and it also explains the ability profile, the things that we've been discussing today in the front. It's really what I wanted to show you here in CogAT.com. So I'm going to go back to our presentation. So here's our slide. That's the URL you need to go out to the Data Manager site. So if you're a teacher and you don't have access to Data Manager, check with your gifted specialist in your building to see if they can help you. And if you're a building level gifted specialist who doesn't have access to Data Manager, check with your district's gifted and talented director. And if you're a GT director and you don't have access to Data Manager, contact Denise or I, and we will make sure to get you set up so you have access to these resources. Okay, so we're going to go in a different direction. I'm going to show you 3 student examples here that have different ability profile scores. So this time I'm going to give you the ability profile score, and I'm going to give you a minute to look at the score that's shown on the screen here for Samuel and break it down into the different elements and see what you can think of in your head. What do you know about this student based upon this ability profile score? All right, so if you look at that leading median Stay9 or the level of Samuel's performance, it's an 8. We know that's above average, and the 8th Stay9 is second from the top. Only he's in the top 11% of students nationally. And since he has a B profile, what does that tell us? 2 of his scores kind of hover together. So he's in the 8th Stay9 in 2 of his batteries. And if we look at this, we can determine what those batteries are. Since he has a relative weakness in the quantitative battery, he's going to have an 8th Stay9 in both the nonverbal and the verbal batteries. So overall, he has strong performance, right? The top 11% in the nation, but he's got a relative weakness in the quantitative reasoning area. Now, his relative weakness, he may be in the 7th stay-9, which is still above average in terms of ability performance. So, but it is a relative weakness for this particular student. So Sam is probably going to need a little bit more support in math. He may not have as much confidence in this area. All right, let's look at our next student, Jeremy, who has a 7A profile. Break that down into its 2 components. So since Jeremy has a 7A, his scores are above average. They're above the national average. He's going to score in all 3 areas in the 77th to 89th percentile. So the A tells us that all of his scores are about the same. So Jeremy's leading median stay-9, the 7A, is very meaningful, and in fact is what you have to differentiate for this student. So since he doesn't have any particular weaknesses, you're going to want to work to develop all of his areas of reasoning equally. And they suggest using his current interest and achievement to help tailor instruction for him. All right, this is our 3rd student, Carmen. She has a 4E, V+, and minus profile. Let's think about first just that 4 and the E. The E is going to be extreme. She has a 4. That's at the low end of average, right? And since that's her median stay-9 at the 4th, she has another score that's a 4 or lower. And it's probably going to be lower since she has a relative strength and weakness, and that's in the nonverbal battery. So since she had an E profile, you're going to want to look at each of those individual battery scores to differentiate for this student, because they're going to be very different from one another. Luckily for her, she has a relative strength in the verbal reasoning, and we know how important that is for learning. So that's going to really be used to help differentiate for this student. Her leading stay-9 isn't as meaningful because this only occurs in her quantitative battery. The nonverbal is going to be lower and the verbal battery is going to be higher. So she's going to need to leverage that strength and verbal reasoning to support her other relative weaknesses. And you're also going to want to look at her testing scores. Since she is an E profile and it's rarer than the other types, you just want to make sure that what you're seeing on your CogAT scores matches up with her achievement picture, what you know about this student, just to make sure there wasn't a problem during testing, because they really are kind of rare. All right. So now that we've had a chance to dissect the ability profile score, look at some of the resources you can use to differentiate and, you know, kind of apply your skills, let's look at a list of some of the resources that are available to you. So we've talked about the score interpretation guide and the short guide for teachers, which are both found in the digital resources of Data Manager. And then coming soon, we have the CogAT guide for teachers. Look for that in the next quarter. And it's going to just be a more robust revision of the short guide for teachers. And we're going to look at a couple of the new features that you're going to find there. But first, I want to show you CogAT.com. This is a great resource that you can share with parents, or educators can go to this site. So you're going to want to find a student's ability profile score. I've got a sample of 3 different reports and where that ability profile score could be found. This is a student profile report, and it's there in that upper left-hand corner, the student's ability profile score. On this report, this is our most popular report that gets sent home to parents, at the profile narrative report. And in that lower left-hand corner, in the smallest print possible, you'll find the student's ability profile, as well as directions to go to www.cogat.com that you can share with the parent. So that's where you find it on the parent report. And then on the list of student scores, you're going to find along that right edge all the different profile scores for the students of a class. So if we take a student's profile score and we go to cogat.com, you're going to plug in an individual score. You have to do it one at a time. If I have a score of a 7A, there's only 2 elements to plug in. So you have your stay-9, the 7 is going to go here on the far left. The A is going to go under profile. And then this student, A profile doesn't have a relative strength or weakness, but you have to fill in none in these two circles for it to work. And once you fill in all 4 boxes, you're going to click View Profile, and it's going to bring you up a 2-page explanation of the profile, the student's characteristics that you're going to find, and some instructional suggestions. So CogAT.com is a very condensed and easy to use resource to begin differentiating. So if the score interpretation guide or the short guide for teachers feels too overwhelming, start with www.cogat.com. And this is open to parents, as I suggested. You can go ahead in your handouts that Karen has shared with you with the evaluation. I've included this page shown here on the screen of how to use the CogAT.com site. So you can go ahead and duplicate that and hand it out to other teachers in your building, or give it to parents when you discuss their students' CogAT scores.
Wendy, can I pop in here for just a moment?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that ability profile score is only available when you take all 9 subtests of CogAT. If you're doing the CogAT screener, which not many districts in Colorado are doing, thankfully, you will not get that ability profile if you're just doing the screener.
If you do the screener with post-screener, you will take all 9 subtests and then get an ability profile score. That's an excellent point. Thank you, Denise. All right, so this is a look at the topics that are covered in the newly revised CogAT Guide for Teachers. And where it really has changed is down at the bottom here, part 7. We've added in all kinds of case studies and instructional examples. After working with groups of teachers, Dr. Lakin worked with 2 different groups of teachers to get their feedback and to really build this part of the new guide up. As well as there's a new section on grouping. So I thought I would look at some of the grouping suggestions. So in addition to those case studies and instructional examples, you're going to have suggestions for putting students together. And we know that students can learn from one another through observation and through interaction. And since development occurs along many dimensions, what we want to do is find ways to group students broadly with activities to engage many at once rather than doing it very narrowly, and also being able to manage a classroom of students and being able to differentiate. If we can group them, it's going to be a lot easier. So Dr. Lakin has put together some great resources to help you group your students. So shown here on the screen is a table, and you can see how if you take one classroom of students and across the top you have the different stay-9 levels, and then across the left-hand side you have the different profile types or the patterns. So the A profile, the B with a relative strength, a B with a relative weakness, a C profile, and an E. And if you put your students into this grid with their profile score, it's going to help you as you look at a need to group when the opportunity arises, how you might put together those groups. Now, the good news I have about this particular method of grouping, not only is it in that new CogAT guide, which isn't available yet, but I was able to share with you through Karen a Cognitively Speaking newsletter that has the same chart in it. So if you look at the handouts that Karen sends you, you'll notice that this newsletter has some instruction on how to use that table for grouping. So that's a resource you have right away. Now, Dr. Lakin has put together another way to group students, and that's shown here on the screen. And it's just a different format to lay them out in. That will be in that new CogAT guide, and you'll have the slide here in the deck that you can refer back to later. So you have 2 options for grouping your students that I hope will be useful for you. So we're coming towards the end of the presentation. I've put in here links to some recordings that Dr. Lakin has put together on the ability profile. The top 2 are longer in length. They're an hour in length each, and the bottom 2 are 10-minute videos or webinars that are quick reviews. So those links might be helpful to you going forward. And she also has a blog that there's several articles she's posted, and I've included 2 of these. I've given them to Karen that I've printed out for you and given as a PDF that she's going to attach. So there's a list of some great resources besides the score interpretation guide and the short guide for teachers that you might want to access. So with that, I'm going to put up here on the screen some contact information for our customer service line, as well as data manager technical support, and then the contact information for both Denise and myself. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denise to see if she's had any questions that have been submitted.
Well, we've only had one question, and I don't really know the answer to it. Are the C profiles the students' potential 2E candidates? So I'm really not quite sure about what a 2E is.
Well, for a twice exceptional student, I don't know if that,
Okay.
I don't really know the answer to that either. So I could see that a student could fall into to either a C or an E profile. And I think maybe I can definitely bring this back to our product manager to get that answered for you, but I don't feel comfortable answering that question either. If there's,
I'm not either. Yeah.
Excellent question. Thank you. You stumped us right off the top. If you do have a question you didn't have time to submit, go ahead and use the chat box to submit any questions. We have a little bit of time still. And while I give you a moment, I have an extra slide here I thought I would put in. It's in your deck. We have introduced CogAT Form 8, and I find sometimes there's confusion that when a new form comes out, it makes the previous form irrelevant. That is not the case with Form 8. Form 8 is parallel to Form 7, and we're really excited to have both Form 7 and Form 8. There's not an advantage or disadvantage to either form. They have the same subtests, the same item types. You administer them identically. It's just that the content is completely unique between the two forms. So having two forms is helpful if you need to retest a student right away. If you had given them Form 7, you could retest them in a week using Form 8. We also have districts that wanted to spiral the two tests, maybe use one form in the fall and one in the spring, or actually have a classroom of students, if you're using paper pencil, that took Form 7, some of them, and some of them had Form 8. And you can also use it if you're using the CogAT screener in paper pencil. You could do the pre-screener with 7 and the post-screener with 8. So that's some information on the new form.
We do have another question. You had mentioned predicted level. What does that mean? I think I can answer. Yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
Well, and a predicted level of achievement. So if you look at a student's CogAT scores, let's say, and they scored up in the 8th and 9th stay 9 across the batteries, it's a student with pretty high abilities, right? But if you look at their achievement scores and you find you have a student whose scores are maybe, average, there is a disparity there. You have a student with very high abilities that's not performing academically, or their achievement scores aren't as high. So that's going to help you identify those kids. Maybe the student is bored. It just gives you some more information to take a second look at the student to see what's happening. And if that didn't answer your question, please send it in via the chat. Did you have anything to add to that, Denise?
No, and then another person said I would venture that you're, oh, I don't think that answers it. But yeah, if your predicted score is low and they're performing very high in their achievement, or their predicted score is, it's just there's a disconnect.
Yes. Between
their ability and their actual achievement. And that is, I don't see any other questions at this time.
Okay, we still have a minute left, so I'm going to put an exciting announcement out there if you haven't heard it yet. So for Form 8, we do have new audio languages coming online for those of you that test online. We'll be introducing next fall 6 new languages, including Arabic, both Mandarin and Cantonese, Russian, Somali, and Vietnamese, in addition to English and Spanish. So if you use online testing in the audio track, we'll have audio instructions in all those languages available to you if you have that need within your district. So that's really exciting.
Okay, well, I want to thank Wendy and Denise for sharing with us today. I have all their information that they sent and the PowerPoint. You can gain access to that at the end of the survey, which I posted in the chat. It should be a live link. If it's not a live link, then you can copy it and put it in your browser. If you would fill that out before you go on to dinner or whatever you're going to do after this, that would really be appreciated, and then you can download all those documents. I also have some others that I had used in my district. I noticed that they were hoping for some more resources on how to develop a cognitive ability. Some of the resources, and I think they also come from Riverside, but some that I pulled went into quite a bit of detail on how you might actually differentiate different tasks based on a student's strength or weakness. So I'm going to see if I can locate those. I've taken attendance and I have your emails. And so when I find those, I'll shoot those your direction as well. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy and Denise.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The survey is up in the, I'll type it in again. It's up in the chat. So it should be the last part of the chat right now.
And if you happen to have other questions, you are more than welcome to contact either Denise and I, and we'll get you an answer.
I'm just going to leave this up for a while so that they can copy any of these or add their questions.
Okay, great.
And if I see any more questions, I can actually copy them and send them to you. Let's see. And then how will I get the answers to them? I could send the answers when I send the other resources.
Okay. Or if they want to be contacted directly, we're more than happy to do that.
Yes, great.
Thank you so much, Karen, for organizing this.
Well, thank you for doing this. And I think this will be great information. We'll try to get this made accessible so we can post it on the website.
Terrific. And if you'll share any feedback with me, it helps me. I present
Oh, you bet.
a topic quite often, and it will help me